Imagine surviving winter without a fireplace, central heating, or even a decent sweater. Welcome to ancient Rome, where the architecture was grand but staying warm was basically a survival game. No cozy logs crackling in the corner, no chimney with smoke curling into the sky. Just you shivering like a gladiator who forgot his armor and just realized the other guy has a trident. Ancient Rome wasn't exactly the Arctic, but it wasn't all sunshine and sandals either. Winters in the city of Rome itself were chilly but not unbearable, with temperatures averaging around 39 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Some days it even dipped below freezing. Try looking noble in a toga while shaking like a guy who's forgot to clear his browser history before handing his phone to his mom. And if you've ever wondered whether it snowed in ancient Rome, the answer is yes, but just often enough to surprise everyone and ruin their sandals. The farther north you went in the empire, the more winter stopped being a season and started being a personal vendetta against your comfort. Places like the Alps, Gaul, modern France, and the Balkans had brutal, snowy winters. But if you were unlucky enough to be stationed near Hadrian's Wall in Britain, congratulations. You were officially in Game of Thrones territory. Freezing rain, relentless wind, and barbarians charging at you like they'd just found out Rome raised their taxes. Writers back then moaned about winter like your friend who accidentally skipped leg day again. Speaking of heat, you wouldn't believe what the medieval Romans had to do to keep warm in winter. If you were rich, or better yet, senatorial rich, you didn't suffer as much. Why? Because of a little genius invention called the hypocaust. This was basically ancient Rome's version of central heating. How did it work? Well, imagine your house was built on stilts, but instead of empty space underneath, there were columns of brick creating a hollow floor. Now take a small furnace burning somewhere in the house and let the hot air circulate under the floors and through the walls. Boom! Heated house. The hypocaust system was like the ancient version of central heating, only with more danger, smoke, and very questionable air quality. Imagine living in a pizza oven that's also trying to roast you alive. It's like the medieval version of having your own personal sauna, only more likely to kill you. Except there were a few catches. First, you needed a team of enslaved people constantly tending the fire to keep it running. Second, it wasn't exactly safe. You could get roasted alive if the heat got too intense. And third, it was only for the rich. The average Roman citizen had to make do with much less. In fact, recent archaeological studies of medieval Romans confirm that hypocaust systems were mainly used in wealthy homes, bathhouses, and important public buildings. Also, a few studies suggest that mold and air quality issues may have developed in hypocaust-heated buildings. If the tiles cracked or moisture seeped in, you weren't just warm, you were breathing in ancient mildew. Imagine your underfloor heating breaking down, but instead of calling a plumber, your entire house fills with smoke or catches fire, and now you're looking for a Roman fire extinguisher that doesn't exist. But if you weren't so rich to afford a hypocaust system, then you'll opt for bathhouses, more like ancient hot tubs. I mean, when your house is basically an icebox, you need somewhere warm to escape to, right? That's where public baths came in. Roman baths weren't just for cleaning yourself. They were like ancient day spas where you could soak in hot water, caldarium, sit in a steam room, and warm up before facing the cold again. Bathhouses were heated by, you guessed it, the hypocaust system. The rich could afford private baths in their villas, but most Romans relied on public bathhouses to stay warm. It was kind of like how people today use coffee shops as their second home, except instead of Wi-Fi and overpriced lattes, it was awkward communal nudity. However, if you were poor or just an average Roman, staying warm in winter meant relying on braziers. Braziers were basically big metal bowls filled with burning charcoal or wood. It was the ancient equivalent of a space heater. If space heaters also had a high chance of giving you carbon monoxide poisoning and slowly turning your apartment into a death trap. It's like living in a scented candle store, but without the nice smells and the 90% chance of dying in your sleep. Imagine huddling around one of these in your little apartment in Roman apartment blocks called the insulae. You get a bit of warmth, sure, but there's also smoke everywhere. If you don't open a window, you risk suffocating in your sleep, but if you do open a window, well, congrats, now you're just cold again. It was a delicate balance between staying warm and not dying, and honestly, I don't think the Romans always got it right. But if you don't want to sleep at night and find yourself singing with the angels because a brazier made you inhale carbon monoxide, then the easiest way to fight the cold was to wear half your wardrobe at once, since fireplaces were not a thing. Romans layered up like they were preparing for a fashion runway in the Arctic. First, they started with a tunic, basically the ancient version of a long t-shirt. But in winter, one tunic wasn't enough. They'd throw on a second, sometimes even a third, because nothing says, I'm prepared for the cold, like dressing like a human onion. Then came the cloak game, and trust me, it was serious business. Wealthy Romans rocked thick woolen cloaks called paenulae, while the poorer folks wrapped themselves in whatever fabric they could get their hands on, probably repurposing old blankets, curtains, or anything remotely warm. And let's not forget the ultimate winter flex, the toga. Normally a symbol of status and dignity, in winter it became an emergency blanket. Rich Romans would layer it over their tunics, wrapping it so tightly that moving their arms was probably optional. Imagine trying to go about your day bundled up like a burrito. It wasn't about convenience. It was about not freezing to death. Speaking of blankets, did you know Romans mostly wore woolen clothes during the winter? The real genius of wool is that they're like nature's version of a heated blanket. It traps body heat like a champ, keeping you warm even when the air around you is doing its best to turn you into an icicle. And unlike other fabrics, wool can still insulate even when wet. That meant if you got caught in freezing rain or misty Roman winters, you weren't completely doomed. Soldiers stationed in places like Britain or Germania relied on wool cloaks like their lives depended on it. Because, well, they kind of did. However, the most fascinating thing about wearing wool was how peasant Romans got it. Roman peasants couldn't just stroll into a market and grab a nice wool coat off the rack. Staying warm in winter was a full-time job, and unless you were rich, it meant a whole lot of work and a whole lot of sheep. Most wool came from local flocks, so if you lived in the countryside, you, or someone in your village, probably had a few, which meant the whole process starts with shearing the sheep. A process that was less like a casual trim and more like a wrestling match with a wool-covered tank that did not want a haircut. The shears were basically oversized medieval scissors, and unless you were an expert, both you and the sheep walked away looking like you lost a fight. But that was just the beginning, because freshly shorn wool? Absolutely filthy. We're talking dirt, grease, lanolin, and maybe a few unexpected insect roommates. So next came cleaning the wool, and you wouldn't believe that they washed it with stale urine. Yep, instead of a nice lemon-scented detergent, Romans relied on ammonia-rich pee to strip away the grease. So the next time you complain about your laundry routine, just remember, it could be so much worse. Once the wool was somewhat clean, it had to be spun into thread using a spindle, then woven into fabric, a process that took forever, like weeks, just to make enough material for a single tunic. No wonder hand-me-downs were practically a family heirloom. And if you wanted to add a little style, that was even more work. Rich people could afford fancy dyes made from plants, minerals, or even crushed bugs like murex snails for that royal purple, but most peasants just wore whatever color their sheep came in, so brown, gray, and off-white were the height of medieval fashion. After all that effort, you'd finally have yourself a scratchy, slightly funky-smelling wool tunic that was about as comfortable as hugging a cactus. The only thing standing between you and freezing to death. No fast fashion, no trendy winter coats, just months of labor for a single piece of clothing. And you bet they wore it until it fell apart. In fact, one medieval text mentions a peasant complaining about the discomfort of woolen clothing, saying it itched so much that wearing it felt like being punished for sins he hadn't committed yet. And let's not forget durability. Wool clothing lasted forever. Well, maybe not forever, but long enough that if you inherited your dad's old wool cloak, you were probably wearing a piece of history. And maybe a little bit of his sweat. The downside? Wool was warm, but it was also an absolute pain. First, it was itchy as heck. Imagine wrapping yourself in a blanket made of tiny needles. That was the reality of wearing cheap, untreated wool. The wealthy got softer versions, but if you were an everyday Roman, comfort was not part of the deal. Then there was the smell. Wet wool stinks. If you've ever been caught in the rain wearing a wool sweater, you know exactly what I mean. Now imagine an entire city full of people wearing damp wool cloaks, packed together in narrow streets and public bathhouses. Rome probably smelled like a giant, sweaty sheep farm. Oh, and let's not forget maintenance. Washing wool was a nightmare. There were no dry cleaners, and tossing it in water made it shrink faster than your willpower on a Monday morning. If you didn't wash it properly, you either ended up with a child-sized cloak or a stiff, crusty tunic that smelled like last week's dinner. Here's a wild fun fact. Medieval wool clothing could literally crawl away on its own. Okay, not literally, but since wool absorbed moisture and body oils, it became the perfect breeding ground for lice, fleas, and all kinds of tiny, unwanted guests. In fact, some medieval people believed wool naturally produced these pests because no matter what they did, their clothes always seemed to be full of them. So if you've ever complained about an itchy sweater, just be glad it's not itchy because it's alive. What about footwear? Thick socks and extra padding were a must. Soldiers stationed in the freezing north stuffed their sandals with wool or fur, basically turning them into ancient Uggs. Meanwhile, inside the drafty Roman apartments, people huddled under as many layers as possible, looking less like citizens of a mighty empire and more like toddlers whose parents dressed them for a snowstorm. At the end of the day, staying warm in medieval Rome wasn't about fashion. It was about wearing half your wardrobe at once and hoping you didn't look completely ridiculous. But hey, when your choices were either layering up or turning into a human popsicle, fashion took a back seat. But there was one trick that medieval peasant Romans practically used during winter. Yes, it was the power of body heat. Yeah, it sounds a little weird, but think about it. Romans weren't out here enjoying spacious, cozy bedrooms with electric blankets. If you were an average pleb, you lived in a cramped apartment where personal space was just a myth. So what did you do? You huddled up like a bunch of penguins. Not for comfort, because let's be real, sleeping in a pile of siblings, roommates, and probably a random stray dog wasn't exactly luxurious. But for warmth? Oh yeah, it worked. The human body generates around 100 watts of heat when resting, so stack enough people in one room and congratulations. You've just invented the ancient version of a heated blanket. But wait, it gets better. Humans weren't the only ones in on the let's not freeze to death strategy. Farmers had a secret weapon: livestock. Ever heard of biological central heating? Because that's exactly what cows, sheep, and goats provided. In colder parts of the empire, people didn't just keep animals in separate barns. They let them live inside or in attached stables for one reason: free, renewable heat. Cows, basically big mooing radiators. One cow alone generates 400 to 600 watts of heat, about the same as a small space heater. Now imagine a whole herd chilling in the next room. Suddenly, your humble Roman hut isn't feeling so icy anymore. Sure, your house probably smelled like a barn because it literally was one, but hey, at least you weren't shivering yourself into hypothermia. Plus, built-in milk dispenser, win-win. If you've ever been jammed into a packed subway car in winter and somehow felt like you were in a sauna despite the freezing temperatures outside, congrats. You've basically lived through Roman winter survival tactics. Even with all these layers of woolen clothing, peasant Romans still needed something else to keep warm. That's where the most important feature for survival comes in: food. Romans didn't have the luxury of curling up with a hot chocolate by the fire, but they definitely had their own ways of fighting off the cold, starting with food and drink. Because if you can't change the weather, you might as well eat your way through it. Hot porridge was a winter staple, basically the Roman version of oatmeal, but with more barley and zero sugar, because suffering builds character. Stews and soups, like their beloved Pauls, were another go-to, turning whatever ingredients they had into a warm, comforting meal. Archaeological studies and historical records indicate that grains like wheat, barley, and rye formed the backbone of the diet. However, fresh grain harvests happened in the warmer months, so by winter, people were eating stored or dried grain. Some of it probably got a little stale, but hey, moldy bread is just extra seasoning, right? But that's not all. Lentils, chickpeas, and fava beans were common because they stored well and provided much-needed protein. Think of them as the medieval version of meal prepping, except instead of neatly packed containers, you had big sacks of dried beans. And since refrigeration wasn't an option, unless you lived in the mountains, food preservation was key. Meats were smoked or salted, fish, especially in coastal areas, was dried, and vegetables were pickled. Fermented foods like garum, Rome's infamous fermented fish sauce, were also widely used, because nothing says delicious winter meal like fish sauce on your barley stew. Anyway, milk didn't store well, but cheese and butter did, so wealthier Romans and peasants with livestock often relied on dairy products through winter. Cheese, especially hard varieties, was a big deal. Imagine a medieval Roman trying to decide between eating it or using it as a weapon. And then there was Colida, hot spiced wine, aka ancient mulled wine, which not only warmed you up, but also made you care a whole lot less about how cold it actually was. Given that moderation wasn't exactly Rome's strong suit, let's just say a lot of people were surviving winter one very generous cup of wine at a time. But here's the downside about the hot spiced wine and feeding in winter, which medieval Romans didn't know. Too much alcohol equals bad winter survival. Alcohol makes you feel warm by dilating blood vessels, but it actually lowers your core temperature. Romans didn't know this, so a lot of people were probably stumbling around in the cold thinking they were fine when they really weren't. And there was the problem of inadequate vitamin C. Citrus fruits weren't common in Rome, so scurvy was a real risk for those who didn't eat enough fruits and vegetables. A bunch of Romans probably froze their toes off while also dealing with bleeding gums. Finally, let's not forget that some Romans had the ultimate winter survival strategy. Just leave. If you had enough money to make it rain sesterti, why sit around shivering when you could just pack up and head south? Wealthy Romans treated winter like an annoying house guest, ignored it completely, and vacationed in Sicily, North Africa, or Egypt, where the sun was shining, and the only ice they saw was floating in their wine. This was basically the ancient version of rich people today escaping to Miami or the south of France when winter hits. While the peasants were layering on scratchy wool and hoping for the best, the elites were out there sunbathing and pretending they were really feeling for everyone back home. Because nothing says empathy like sipping imported Falernian wine on a beach while your neighbors are freezing their togas off.